The pen hovered millimeters above the signature line, trembling in William Montgomery's weathered hand. $500 million hung in the balance, the largest merger in Montgomery Holdings' 40-year history. The Nashville boardroom buzzed with anticipation as executives leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the contract that would crown Bill's legacy. "Just sign it, Bill," Clayton Reeves urged, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is what Margaret would have wanted." The mention of his dead wife's name sent a familiar ache through Bill's chest. 3 years since cancer had claimed her, and still Clayton knew exactly which wounds to press. That's when she appeared, Grace Walker, the night janitor, pushing her cleaning cart with quiet dignity. Her blonde hair caught the fluorescent light as she moved toward his chair, her blue eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him freeze. She leaned close, her voice barely a whisper against his ear. "Don't sign this." The pen slipped from Bill's fingers, clattering onto the mahogany table. Every face in the room turned toward the cleaning woman who had just whispered 6 words that would expose a web of lies 20 years in the making. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Grace Elizabeth Walker had pushed through the revolving doors of Montgomery Holdings for the first time, her worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder and hope flickering in her chest like a candle in winter wind. The 40-story glass tower pierced Nashville's skyline, its steel and chrome facade reflecting a city that seemed to have forgotten people like her existed. At 26, Grace carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that survival required both strength and invisibility. Her blonde hair, pulled back in a simple ponytail, framed a face that spoke of sleepless nights and worry lines earned too young. The pre-med textbooks gathering dust in her cramped apartment served as daily reminders of the dreams she'd abandoned when her father's cancer had consumed their savings, and her mother's mind had shattered under the weight of grief. "Night shift, floors 30 through 40, the security guard had explained, handing her a magnetic key card. "You'll be working alone mostly. These executive types don't much notice the help anyway." Grace had nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. She was meant to be a ghost, moving through their world without leaving traces of her own existence behind. The man who owned this empire, William Montgomery III, was a study in contrasts that intrigued her despite her determination to remain detached. At 48, Bill Montgomery possessed the weathered handsomeness of a man who had built his fortune with his own hands, rather than inheriting it. The photographs lining his office walls told a story of transformation. From a young man in work boots standing beside construction sites to the silver-haired executive who now commanded boardrooms across the South. But it was the smaller details that spoke to Grace's heart. The fresh flowers replaced weekly on his desk, always white roses, Margaret's favorite according to the nameplate that still read Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, despite 3 years of widowhood, the reading glasses left forgotten on financial reports. The coffee mug with "World's Best Dad" painted in a child's unsteady hand, though employees whispered that the Montgomerys had never been blessed with children. Clayton Reeves, the company's chief financial officer, moved through these same halls with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. Tall and sharp-suited, with steel-gray hair and calculating eyes, Clayton had been Bill's right hand for 2 decades. The employees spoke of him with a mixture of respect and wariness. He was efficient, brilliant, and utterly without warmth. Grace had been cleaning these offices for 3 weeks when she first noticed the discrepancies in Clayton's late-night activities, the hushed phone calls that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, the files that disappeared and reappeared with suspicious regularity. In the sterile fluorescent lighting of those empty corridors, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's ambitions, Grace Walker began to uncover secrets that would shake the foundations of everything William Montgomery believed about loyalty, friendship, and the woman he had loved. The first sign that something wasn't right came on a Tuesday night in October, when Grace discovered Clayton Reeves hunched over his computer at 2 in the morning, his face illuminated by the blue glow of spreadsheets that shouldn't have existed. She had been cleaning the executive floor in her usual methodical pattern, vacuum the corridors, empty the waste baskets, dust the conference rooms, when she noticed light bleeding from beneath Clayton's office door. Grace paused, her hand tightening around the handle of her cleaning cart. In 3 weeks of night shifts, she had never encountered anyone working this late, not even Bill Montgomery, who seemed to carry the weight of his empire on his shoulders. The prudent thing would have been to turn around, to continue her rounds and pretend she had seen nothing. But Grace had learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was look away when something felt wrong. Her father had taught her that lesson during his final months, when doctors' reassurances rang hollow and insurance claims disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. She pressed her ear to the door and heard Clayton's voice, low and urgent, speaking to someone on the phone. "The timeline has to be moved up," he was saying. "Montgomery's getting too comfortable, asking too many questions about the quarterly reports. We can't afford to wait until spring." Grace's pulse quickened. She knew enough about business to understand that employees didn't typically discuss their boss's comfort level with mysterious third parties at 2 in the morning. "I don't care about the complications," Clayton continued, his voice taking on an edge that made Grace's skin crawl. "Margaret was a complication too, and we handled that just fine." The mention of Bill's dead wife sent ice water through Grace's veins. She had seen the way Bill's face softened whenever someone mentioned Margaret, the way his hand would unconsciously reach for the wedding ring he still wore. The love between them had been legendary among the company's long-term employees, the kind of devotion that survived even death. Grace forced herself to breathe quietly as Clayton's voice dropped to a whisper. "The merger documents are ready. Once Montgomery signs, the shell companies will have controlling interest in the real estate portfolio. He'll retain maybe 15% if he's lucky." A pause, then a cold laugh that made Grace's stomach turn. "By the time he realizes what happened, we'll be long gone with the assets liquidated." The pieces began forming a picture that terrified Grace. Clayton wasn't just Bill's trusted CFO. He was orchestrating the systematic destruction of everything Bill had built. And somehow, Margaret's death was connected to this web of betrayal. Grace backed away from the door as quietly as she could manage, her mind racing. She needed proof, something more substantial than overheard phone conversations. But she also needed to be careful. If Clayton was willing to betray a 20-year friendship for money, he certainly wouldn't hesitate to destroy a janitor who had stumbled onto his scheme. Over the following weeks, Grace developed a careful routine of observation. She learned Clayton's patterns, memorized his schedule, and began photographing documents left carelessly on his desk. The evidence painted an increasingly disturbing picture: fake invoices, manipulated financial reports, and most damning of all, correspondence with shell companies that existed only on paper. But it was the personal items hidden in Clayton's locked desk drawer that truly chilled her blood. Grace had learned to pick locks during her leaner college years, a skill acquired out of necessity when textbook money was scarce and library resources were locked away after hours. What she found in that drawer changed everything she thought she knew about Margaret Montgomery's death. Medical records showed that Margaret's cancer treatment had been handled privately, outside the usual network of specialists. The bills were addressed to Clayton, not Bill. And the medication receipts told a story that made Grace's hands shake as she photographed them. Experimental treatments that weren't approved by the FDA, purchased through overseas suppliers with no legitimate medical oversight. Clayton hadn't just stolen Bill's money. He had slowly, methodically murdered Bill's wife. The realization hit Grace like a physical blow. Margaret Montgomery hadn't died of cancer. She had been poisoned by the man Bill trusted most in the world, the man who had stood beside him at her funeral and offered comfort in his darkest hours. Grace sat in her car in the parking garage that night, staring at the photos on her phone and trying to process the magnitude of what she had uncovered. She thought of her own mother, Helen, struggling with the aftermath of trauma that doctors couldn't quite diagnose or treat. She thought of her father, who had died believing in the goodness of the medical professionals treating him, never knowing that some people wore white coats while harboring the blackest of hearts. The ethical choice was clear, but the practical implications terrified her. Clayton Reeves was a powerful man with powerful connections. Grace Walker was nobody, a college dropout cleaning offices for minimum wage. Who would believe her word against his? But then she thought of Bill Montgomery, working late into the night, carrying the weight of grief and responsibility while the man who had murdered his wife plotted his financial destruction. Some truths demanded to be spoken, regardless of the cost. Grace started her car and drove home through the empty Nashville streets, already formulating a plan that would either save Bill Montgomery or destroy them both. The discovery came on a rainy Thursday evening in November, tucked between the pages of a leather-bound journal that Grace found wedged behind Margaret Montgomery's portrait in Bill's office. The journal had fallen when Grace was dusting the ornate frame, and as she bent to retrieve it, several loose pages scattered across the Persian rug like fallen leaves carrying secrets. Margaret's handwriting was delicate, precise, the script of a woman who had attended finishing school and believed that penmanship reflected character. But it was the content that made Grace's breath catch in her throat as she knelt on the office floor, reading by the light of the desk lamp. March 15th. Clayton came by again today while Bill was in Atlanta. He brought flowers, white roses like always, and that smile that never quite reaches his eyes. I told him I wasn't feeling well enough for company, but he insisted on staying. He made tea and watched me drink every drop. I felt sick afterward, but he said it was just the chemo making me sensitive. Grace's hands trembled as she turned the page. The entries continued, painting a picture that grew darker with each revelation. March 22nd. Dr. Hartwell called with my latest test results. He seemed confused, said my white cell count was dropping faster than expected. Clayton happened to be here when the call came. He took the phone and spoke to the doctor privately. When he hung up, he said we needed to try a more aggressive treatment protocol, something experimental that Bill wouldn't understand. The journal entries painted a horrifying portrait of manipulation and slow murder. Clayton had positioned himself as Margaret's primary caregiver during her treatment, taking advantage of Bill's frequent business trips to gradually poison the woman they both claimed to love. Grace photographed every page with shaking hands, her heart hammering as she absorbed the full scope of Clayton's betrayal. But it was the final entry, dated just 3 days before Margaret's death, that revealed the truth Grace had suspected, but hoped wasn't real. April 8th. I found the empty bottles in Clayton's car today when he asked me to get his briefcase. Sodium azide. I remember it from my chemistry classes at Vanderbilt. It's used in research labs, highly toxic in small doses. I confronted him, and his mask finally slipped. He told me he loved me, that he'd always loved me, that he couldn't watch me choose Bill over him anymore. He said if he couldn't have me, then Bill couldn't either. I'm so scared. I tried to call the police, but he's cut the phone lines. I've hidden this journal behind my portrait. If something happens to me, I pray someone will find it and know the truth. Grace sat back on her heels, the weight of Margaret's final words pressing down on her like a physical force. The woman had known she was being murdered and had tried desperately to leave evidence behind. For 3 years, that evidence had sat hidden while Clayton continued his elaborate charade of friendship and loyalty. But there was more. Tucked between the journal's final pages was a photograph that made Grace's blood run cold. It showed Clayton and Margaret at what appeared to be a family gathering, But they weren't positioned as friends or colleagues. They were seated together with an older couple, and the resemblance was unmistakable. The same sharp cheekbones, the same calculating eyes. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded ink, "Clayton and Margaret Reeves, Christmas 1975, age 8 and 6. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Clayton and Margaret weren't just friends who had grown up in Nashville social circles. They were siblings, brother and sister separated by some family tragedy and reunited as adults. Clayton's obsession with Margaret hadn't been romantic love at all, but something far more twisted and possessive. Grace's mind raced as she considered the implications. If Clayton and Margaret were siblings, then his claims of unrequited love had been an elaborate fiction designed to explain his unusual involvement in her medical care. The truth was far more disturbing. He had killed his own sister rather than watch her happiness with another man. The sound of the elevator arriving on the executive floor jolted Grace back to the present. She quickly gathered the journal pages, slipped them back into their hiding place, and resumed her cleaning routine just as footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. "Grace?" Bill's voice carried a note of surprise as he entered his office. "Working late tonight?" She turned to face him, acutely aware of the evidence she had just uncovered burning like a secret flame in her chest. Bill looked exhausted, his usually immaculate appearance rumpled from a long day of meetings. His eyes held the perpetual sadness that had become his signature since Margaret's death, but there was something else there tonight, a wariness that suggested he was beginning to sense that all was not well in his carefully ordered world. "Just finishing up your office, Mr. Montgomery," Grace replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the earthquake of revelation still reverberating through her mind. "I can come back tomorrow if you need to work." "No, please continue," Bill said, settling behind his desk with a sigh. He glanced up at Margaret's portrait as he did every night, but this time his gaze lingered on the frame where the journal was hidden. "Grace, can I ask you something?" Her pulse quickened. "Of course." "You've been working here for 2 months now, and I've noticed you're different from the other cleaning staff. More observant, more educated." His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "What's your story? And don't tell me you've always wanted to clean offices. I can see in your eyes that you've had other dreams." For a moment Grace considered deflecting the question with polite vagueness, but something in Bill's manner, the genuine concern, the recognition of her intelligence, made her want to trust him with the truth. "I was pre-med at Vanderbilt," she said quietly. "Had to drop out when my father got sick. Cancer, the medical bills, and then taking care of my mother afterward. Well, dreams don't pay the rent." Bill's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was. But we do what we have to do for family, right?" The irony of her words, given what she had just learned about Clayton's twisted definition of family loyalty, wasn't lost on her. "Yes," Bill agreed, his voice heavy with meaning. "Though sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest." Grace studied his face, wondering if he suspected the truth about Clayton or if he was simply speaking from the general pain of loss. Either way, his words felt like an opening, a chance to begin the delicate process of exposing the man who had destroyed his life while masquerading as his closest friend. "Mr. Montgomery," she said carefully, "if you ever suspected that someone close to you wasn't who they seemed to be, what would you do?" Bill's eyes sharpened with interest. "That's a dangerous question, Grace, and probably one that deserves a very careful answer." The weight of Margaret's journal seemed to pulse behind the portrait frame, 3 years of secrets demanding to be revealed. Grace realized she had reached a crossroads. She could continue cleaning offices and pretend she had never uncovered the truth, or she could risk everything to give Bill Montgomery the justice his wife had died trying to secure. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the truth is worth the risk." Bill leaned forward, his full attention focused on her words. I couldn't agree more. The relationship between Grace and Bill evolved slowly over the following weeks, built on stolen moments between her cleaning duties and his late-night work sessions. What began as polite conversation gradually deepened into something neither of them had expected, a connection forged by shared loss and mutual recognition of each other's hidden depths. Grace learned that Bill's gruff exterior masked a man haunted by regret. He spoke of Margaret with a tenderness that made her chest ache, describing a woman who had brought light into his work-obsessed world. But there were shadows in his memories too, guilt over business trips that had kept him away during her illness, self-recrimination for trusting Clayton to manage her care while he secured the company's future. "I thought I was being responsible," he confided one night, standing by the office windows that overlooked Nashville's twinkling skyline. "Keeping the business strong so Margaret would never want for anything. Clayton kept telling me she was in good hands, that he'd make sure she had the best care money could buy." His voice cracked slightly. "I should have been there. I should have seen what was happening." Grace's heart broke for him, knowing the truth she carried like a stone in her chest. Bill's guilt was misplaced. He hadn't failed Margaret through neglect, but through misplaced trust in a man who had systematically murdered her while wearing the mask of devoted friendship. Meanwhile, her mother's condition continued to deteriorate. Helen Walker had never fully recovered from the trauma of watching her husband die slowly and painfully, his suffering prolonged by medical professionals more interested in billing insurance companies than providing comfort. The official diagnosis was severe depression with anxiety disorder, but Grace recognized it as something deeper, a soul sickness that came from losing faith in the fundamental goodness of the world. "The shadow man came by again today," Helen would whisper during Grace's visits to their cramped apartment. Her mother's once bright blue eyes had grown cloudy with medication and fear, her hands trembling as she clutched Grace's fingers. "He asks about you, honey. Wants to know where you work now." Grace's blood would run cold at these moments. She had never told her mother about Clayton, had never even mentioned his name, yet Helen seemed to sense his presence like some primal warning system detecting a predator nearby. "What shadow man, Mama? There's no one here but us." But Helen would just shake her head, pressing her lips together in the stubborn way she'd developed since the trauma began. "He smells like white roses and lies. Promise me you'll be careful, Gracie. Promise me you won't trust the shadow man." The medical bills continued to mount despite Grace's insurance from Montgomery Holdings. Therapy sessions, prescription medications, and the constant threat of hospitalization created a financial pressure that kept Grace awake at night, calculating and recalculating numbers that never seemed to add up to hope. It was during one of these sleepless sessions, hunched over her laptop at the kitchen table with bills spread around her like fallen leaves, that Grace made a decision that would change everything. She opened her email and began typing a message to Bill, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. "Mr. Montgomery, I have information about your wife's death that you need to see. Can we meet privately tomorrow night after the office closes? This is bigger than either of us imagined, and it involves people you trust. Please don't tell anyone about this message. Grace." She stared at the draft for 20 minutes before finally hitting send, her heart hammering against her ribs. There was no going back now. The next evening, Bill was waiting in his office when Grace arrived for her shift. He looked older somehow, the weight of uncertainty etched in the lines around his eyes. On his desk sat a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses, not the expensive crystal he used for entertaining clients, but simple tumblers that spoke of serious conversation between equals. "I got your message," he said without preamble, "and I haven't slept since. Grace, if you know something about Margaret's death, I need to hear it, all of it." Grace retrieved the journal from its hiding place behind Margaret's portrait, her hands steady now that the moment of truth had arrived. She placed it on the desk between them like an offering, watching Bill's face as recognition dawned. "She left this for someone to find," Grace said quietly. "Someone who cared enough to look beyond the obvious." Bill's fingers trembled as he opened the journal, his eyes scanning Margaret's familiar handwriting with growing horror. Grace watched his face transform as he absorbed the truth, saw the moment when 20 years of trust crumbled into dust, when the full scope of Clayton's betrayal became undeniably real. "My God," he whispered, reaching the final entry. "She knew. She tried to warn someone." His eyes met Grace's with desperate intensity. "The photograph. Where did you find this?" "Hidden with the journal." "They're siblings, Bill. Clayton and Margaret were brother and sister." Grace pulled up the research she had conducted over the past weeks on her phone. "I found records from the Tennessee Department of Children's Services. The Reeves family fell apart in 1973. Alcoholic father, mother with mental illness. The children were split up, sent to different foster families. Margaret was adopted by the Caldwells when she was 7, took their name. Clayton aged out of the system, kept his birth name." Bill stared at the photograph as if it might reveal more secrets. "So when he said he loved her, he was telling the truth, just not the kind of love we thought." Grace's voice was gentle but firm. "This was about possession, about a damaged man who couldn't bear to lose the only family connection he'd ever had. When Margaret chose you, when she built a life that didn't center around him, he couldn't accept it. So he killed her." The words came out flat, emotionless, the voice of a man whose world had just collapsed. Slowly, methodically, making it look like the cancer treatment was failing while he poisoned her with compounds that mimicked chemotherapy side effects. Grace leaned forward. "Bill, there's more. Clayton's not just a murderer. He's been systematically looting the company. The merger he's pushing isn't what it seems." She showed him the financial documents she had photographed, explaining the shell companies and fraudulent transfers. Bill listened in silence, his face growing grayer with each revelation. 20 years, he finally said. 20 years I trusted him with everything. My business, my wife's care, my friendship. He poured bourbon into both glasses, pushing one toward Grace. "How did I not see it?" "Because you're a good man who assumes the best in people," Grace replied, accepting the drink. "And Clayton is very, very good at being what people need him to be." They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, each processing the magnitude of what had been revealed. Outside, Nashville continued its nightly rhythm, oblivious to the reckoning unfolding 40 floors above. "Grace," Bill said finally, "why are you telling me this? You could have just kept your head down, done your job, stayed out of it." She considered several answers: duty, justice, simple human decency, but sitting there in the soft light of his office, looking into eyes that had seen too much loss, she found herself telling him the truth. "Because I watched my father die slowly, surrounded by people who claimed to be helping him but were really just prolonging his suffering for profit. I swore I'd never stand by and watch it happen to someone else." She paused, meeting his gaze steadily. "And because Margaret deserved better than to have her murder go unnoticed and unpunished." Bill reached across the desk and covered her hand with his. His touch was warm, calloused from years of real work, and completely without presumption. "Thank you," he said simply. "Margaret always said that sometimes angels come disguised as ordinary people. I think she would have liked you very much." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and the recognition of shared purpose. But it was interrupted by the sound of the elevator arriving on the executive floor, followed by footsteps in the corridor. "That's Clayton," Bill said, his body tensing. "He sometimes works late on Thursdays. Grace quickly gathered the journal and photograph, slipping them into her cleaning supplies cart. "Act normal," she whispered. "Don't let him know you've seen these." Clayton appeared in the doorway moments later, his sharp suit immaculate despite the late hour. His eyes took in the scene, Bill behind his desk, Grace organizing her cleaning supplies, the 2 glasses of bourbon. "Working late, I see," Clayton said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been suspicion. "Grace, isn't it? The new cleaning girl?" "Yes, sir," Grace replied, not trusting herself to say more. "Dedicated employee," Clayton continued, his gaze moving between them. "I hope Bill isn't keeping you from your duties with his storytelling. He does tend to ramble about the old days when he's been drinking." The casual cruelty in his dismissal of Bill's grief made Grace's hands clench around her cleaning cloth. This was the man who had murdered Margaret, who was planning to steal everything Bill had built, and he stood there making jokes about loneliness and loss. "Grace was just finishing up," Bill said, his voice carefully neutral. "We were discussing the quarterly cleaning schedule." "Of course you were." Clayton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, don't let me interrupt your administrative discussion. I just came by to grab some files for tomorrow's meeting with the PharmaCorp representatives." Grace felt her blood turn to ice. PharmaCorp, the company behind Clayton's fraudulent merger. The pieces were falling into place faster than she had anticipated. "The merger meeting?" Bill asked, and Grace could hear the effort it took for him to sound interested rather than horrified. "The final presentation. They're flying in from Dallas tomorrow afternoon." Clayton gathered several folders from his office across the hall. "We should have everything wrapped up by end of business Friday. You'll finally be able to focus on other things, Bill. Maybe even take that vacation Margaret always wanted you to take." The casual mention of Margaret's name, delivered with such calculated cruelty, made Grace want to scream. Instead, she bent over her cleaning cart and began organizing supplies with unnecessary precision. "I'll look forward to it," Bill managed. After Clayton left, Grace and Bill sat in stunned silence. The timeline had just accelerated dramatically. They had less than 24 hours to expose Clayton's scheme before he succeeded in destroying everything Bill had spent his life building. "We have to stop him," Grace said finally. "We will," Bill replied, his voice carrying a new note of steel. "But we're going to need help. And we're going to need to be very careful about who we trust." Grace nodded, understanding that their tentative relationship had just transformed into something deeper, a partnership forged in the pursuit of justice for a woman who had died trying to protect the man she loved from the monster who wore the face of his best friend. The PharmaCorp executives arrived at Montgomery Holdings on Friday morning like vultures circling a wounded animal. Grace watched from the cleaning closet on the 40th floor as they filed into the conference room. 3 men in identical navy suits carrying leather briefcases and the predatory confidence of people accustomed to acquiring distressed assets at bargain prices. Bill had spent the night in his office poring over the evidence Grace had uncovered while she researched everything she could find about PharmaCorp's acquisition history. The picture that emerged was uglier than either of them had imagined. The company specialized in hostile takeovers disguised as friendly mergers, stripping valuable assets from family-owned businesses before dissolving them into component parts for maximum profit. "They've done this 17 times in the past 5 years, Grace had explained, showing Bill the pattern on her laptop screen. "Always the same method. Find a trusted insider, create financial pressure through market manipulation, then swoop in with a rescue offer that's actually a death sentence." Now, as Grace moved through her morning cleaning routine, she could hear Clayton's voice carrying from the conference room with the enthusiasm of a man about to claim his prize. He was presenting Montgomery Holdings' financial projections with the smooth confidence of a funeral director selling caskets. Sympathetic, professional, and utterly without conscience. "As you can see from the third quarter numbers," Clayton was saying, "the company has been struggling with cash flow issues related to our recent expansion into the Memphis market. What Bill needs is a partner with deep pockets and long-term vision. Grace paused outside the conference room door, her cleaning cart providing perfect camouflage as she listened to the systematic dismantling of Bill's life's work. The real value, of course, is in the commercial properties themselves, one of the PharmaCorp executives replied. His voice carried the flat accent of Dallas money, old oil wealth that had learned to dress itself in corporate respectability. We're prepared to offer fair market value for the real estate portfolio with the understanding that the existing management structure would be streamlined. Grace felt sick. They weren't even pretending to preserve Montgomery Holdings as a functioning business. This was pure asset stripping, and Bill was walking into it blind because he trusted the man who had murdered his wife. She moved closer to the door, straining to hear more details, when a hand fell on her shoulder like a steel trap. "Curious about executive business, Miss Walker?" Grace spun around to find herself face to face with Clayton's assistant, Marcus Webb, a thin, nervous man who had always made her skin crawl. His pale eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction, and Grace realized with growing horror that her surveillance hadn't been as subtle as she'd hoped. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Webb," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear racing through her veins. "Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're eavesdropping on confidential business discussions." Marcus stepped closer, invading her personal space with deliberate intimidation. "Mr. Reeves has been concerned about your unusual interest in executive affairs." Grace's mind raced. If Clayton suspected she knew something, then both she and Bill were in immediate danger. The merger signing was scheduled for 3 o'clock, less than 5 hours away. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but Marcus was already pulling out his phone. "Clayton, it's Marcus. Yes, she's here, right outside the conference room." A pause, then a smile that made Grace's stomach lurch. "Understood. I'll handle it." Marcus ended the call and looked at Grace with the expression of a cat who had cornered a particularly slow mouse. "You're going to come with me, Miss Walker. Mr. Reeves wants to discuss your employment status." Grace knew she had no choice but to follow, her cleaning cart forgotten as Marcus escorted her down the corridor toward Clayton's office. But as they walked, she managed to slip her hand into her pocket and activate the voice recording app on her phone. Whatever was about to happen, she wanted evidence. Clayton's office felt like a tomb when they entered. The blinds were drawn, casting everything in shadow, and the air smelled of expensive cologne and something else, something chemical and sharp that reminded Grace of the hospital where her father had died. "Sit down, Grace." Clayton's voice was different now. No longer the smooth, professional tone he used in meetings, but something colder and more intimate. "We need to have a conversation about boundaries." Grace remained standing, every instinct screaming at her to run. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Haven't you?" Clayton moved to stand behind his desk, his hands resting on a manila folder that Grace recognized with sick certainty. It contained the photographs she had taken of Margaret's journal, the evidence that could send him to prison for murder. "These are very interesting pictures, Grace. Very artistic. You have quite the eye for detail." Clayton opened the folder, revealing printouts of every image she had captured. "The question is, what exactly did you think you were going to do with them?" The trap had been perfectly laid. Clayton had somehow gained access to her phone, downloaded the photos, and now held all the evidence in his possession. Grace realized she had been naive to think she could outmaneuver a man who had successfully murdered his own sister while maintaining the trust of her husband for 3 years. "I don't know what those are," Grace said, but they both knew the lie was pointless. "Don't insult my intelligence." Clayton walked around the desk, moving with the predatory grace of a man who held all the cards. "You found Margaret's little diary, You put together the pieces. You even figured out the family connection. Very impressive detective work for a college dropout. Grace's phone buzzed in her pocket. A text message from Bill asking if she was all right. Clayton noticed her glance toward the sound and smiled. "Bill's worried about you. How touching. He's developed quite the soft spot for his little cleaning lady, hasn't he?" Clayton's voice turned mocking. "The grieving widower and the girl with the sob story. It's almost poetic." "He deserves to know the truth," Grace said, finding her courage in anger. "Margaret deserves justice." "Justice!" Clayton laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Margaret got exactly what she deserved. She chose him over family, chose money and status over blood. I gave her every chance to come home, to remember where she came from, but she preferred playing house with her rich husband." The mask had finally slipped completely. Grace saw the madness in Clayton's eyes now, the twisted logic of a damaged mind that had turned love into possession and family loyalty into murder. "You killed your own sister." "I freed her." Clayton's voice took on an evangelical fervor that chilled Grace's blood. "From the cancer, from the pain, from the guilt of abandoning her family. She thanked me at the end, you know. When the poison finally took hold, she looked at me and whispered, 'I'm sorry, Clay. I should have chosen you from the beginning.'" Grace doubted that Margaret's final words had been anything like Clayton's delusional fantasy, but she didn't dare contradict him. His grip on reality was clearly tenuous, and pushing him might trigger violence. "What do you want from me?" she asked instead. "Simple. You're going to disappear." Clayton returned to his desk and pulled out a check already made out in her name. $50,000, more money than you've ever seen in your pathetic life. Take it and leave Nashville. Tonight, don't contact Bill, don't go to the police, don't even pack your things. Just take the money and vanish. Grace stared at the check, understanding that it represented more than a bribe. It was Clayton's insurance policy. If she disappeared right before the merger signing, it would look like she had been paid off to steal company secrets. Bill would be left with no allies and no evidence, making him completely vulnerable to Clayton's final betrayal. "And if I refuse?" Clayton's smile turned genuinely terrifying. "Then you'll have a tragic accident, something sudden and unexpected like your mother's recent deterioration in mental health. These things run in families, you know. Genetic predisposition to self-harm, especially when combined with financial stress and social isolation." The threat was crystal clear. If Grace didn't take the money and disappear, Clayton would arrange for both her and her mother to die in ways that would appear to be suicide or accidental death. "You have until 2 o'clock to decide," Clayton continued. "The merger signing is at 3, and I need to know you're not going to cause any disruptions. Choose wisely, Grace. This is the only offer you're going to get." Grace took the check with trembling hands, not because she intended to accept it, but because she needed time to think. Clayton watched her with satisfaction, clearly believing he had won another round in his deadly game. "Smart girl. Marcus will escort you out of the building. I'd suggest you spend the next few hours making arrangements, travel plans, that sort of thing. And Grace?" Clayton's voice followed her to the door. "If you try anything foolish, remember that your mother is all alone in that little apartment. Accidents happen so easily to fragile old women." Grace left Clayton's office with her legs shaking and her mind racing. She had less than 4 hours to find a way to stop the merger, expose Clayton's crimes, and protect both herself and her mother from a man who had already committed murder without a trace of remorse. As Marcus escorted her toward the elevator, Grace caught a glimpse of Bill through the conference room's glass walls. He was nodding politely as the PharmaCorp executives explained their vision for Montgomery Holdings' future, completely unaware that he was signing his own death warrant. The elevator doors closed on Grace's view of the man she had come to care for more than she should have allowed herself, carrying her down toward a lobby that might be the last place she ever saw him alive. Clayton had given her a choice between her own survival and Bill's destruction, but Grace Walker had learned long ago that some choices weren't really choices at all. Sometimes doing the right thing meant risking everything, even when everything included the lives of everyone you loved. The clock in the lobby read 11:47 a.m. The merger signing was scheduled for 3 o'clock. Grace had 3 hours and 13 minutes to find a miracle, or watch Clayton Reeves destroy the last good man in her world while she ran for her life with blood money in her pocket. As she walked out of Montgomery Holdings and into the crisp Nashville afternoon, Grace made her decision. She pulled out her phone and began dialing a number she had memorized but hoped never to use, the direct line to Detective Sarah Chen of the Nashville Metro Police Department, a woman who had once told Grace that sometimes the most important evidence came from the most unexpected sources. It was time to find out if the system that had failed her father might finally work for Margaret Montgomery's ghost. Detective Sarah Chen had seen enough corporate crime in her 15 years with Nashville Metro to recognize the signs of a sophisticated inside job, but nothing had prepared her for the story Grace Walker told in the precinct's sterile interview room. The young woman sat across from her, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, recounting a tale of murder, betrayal, and financial fraud that read like something from a crime novel. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Detective Chen said, reviewing her notes. "You're alleging that Clayton Reeves murdered his own sister by poisoning her during cancer treatment, and now he's about to steal $500 million from her husband through a fraudulent merger?" Grace nodded, her blue eyes steady despite the exhaustion etched in her face. "I have Margaret's journal. She documented everything before she died. And I have photographs of Clayton's financial records showing the shell companies and money transfers, which Clayton now has copies of, according to your statement. Yes, he's been monitoring my phone somehow. He knows I found the evidence." Grace leaned forward, urgency creeping into her voice. "Detective Chen, the signing is at 3 o'clock. Once those documents are executed, Bill will lose everything, and Clayton will disappear with assets that can never be recovered." Sarah Chen had worked enough fraud cases to know that time was indeed the enemy. Financial criminals like Clayton Reeves understood that once money crossed certain borders or moved through enough shell companies, recovery became nearly impossible. But she also knew that rushing into accusations against a prominent businessman without ironclad evidence could destroy careers, including her own. "Miss Walker, these are extremely serious allegations." "Murder? Fraud? Conspiracy? We're talking about charges that could put someone away for life. I need more than a journal and some photographs that the suspect has already compromised." Grace's face crumpled with despair. Then he's going to get away with it. Margaret died trying to warn someone, and Clayton's going to destroy Bill just like he destroyed her. The raw pain in Grace's voice stirred something in Detective Chen's chest, a recognition of genuine anguish that couldn't be faked. In her experience, people who fabricated stories for attention or money rarely displayed this kind of authentic emotional devastation. "I'm not saying I don't believe you," Sarah said carefully, "but I need corroborating evidence, something that proves your allegations beyond the word of a dead woman and a cleaning lady against one of Nashville's most respected businessmen." Grace was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she looked up, her expression had hardened with resolve. "What if I could get you a confession? What if Clayton admitted to everything while you were recording?" "That would be incredibly dangerous," Detective Chen replied immediately. "If this man has already committed murder, putting yourself in a room with him could be signing your own death warrant. He's already threatened to kill me and my mother if I don't take his money and disappear. At least this way, if something happens to me, you'll have evidence to prosecute him." Grace pulled out the check Clayton had given her, placing it on the table between them. "This is the blood money he offered me to keep quiet. $50,000 to let Margaret's murder go unpunished and watch him destroy the only good man I've ever known." Detective Chen studied the check, noting the bank routing numbers and Clayton's precise signature. It was certainly evidence of attempted bribery, though proving the underlying crime would still be challenging. "Miss Walker, I understand you care about Mr. Montgomery, but wearing a wire into a confrontation with a suspected murderer is not something I can officially sanction. The department would never approve such a risky operation based on the evidence we currently have." "Then don't make it official." Grace met her eyes with desperate determination. "Give me a recording device. Let me go back to that building and see what Clayton says when I tell him I'm not taking his deal." The request went against every protocol Sarah Chen had learned in her years as a detective, but she had also learned to trust her instincts about people. Grace Walker was either telling the truth about a sophisticated conspiracy, or she was the most convincing liar Sarah had encountered in her career. Given the stakes involved, she decided the risk was worth taking. "If I were to hypothetically provide you with a recording device," Sarah said carefully, "and if you were to hypothetically use it to gather evidence in a private conversation, I would hypothetically need you to understand that you'd be completely on your own. No backup, no official support, no cavalry coming to rescue you if things go wrong." "I understand." "And if Clayton Reeves is everything you say he is, there's a very real chance you won't walk out of that building alive." Grace's smile was sad but determined. "Detective Chen, my father died because people who were supposed to help him cared more about money than doing what was right. My mother is slowly losing her mind because the trauma of watching him suffer destroyed her faith in humanity. If I don't do this, Bill Montgomery is going to suffer the same kind of betrayal, and Clayton Reeves is going to keep hurting people until someone finally stops him." Sarah Chen looked at this young woman who had already lost so much and was willing to risk everything for the sake of a man she barely knew and a dead woman she had never met. It was either incredible courage or incredible foolishness, and sometimes the line between the two was thinner than anyone cared to admit. "There's an electronics store 2 blocks from here," Sarah said finally. "They sell various recording devices to the public. What people choose to do with legally purchased equipment is their own business." Grace understood. "And if someone were to bring you evidence of a crime that was obtained through legal means during a private conversation, you'd be obligated to investigate it." "Hypothetically speaking, yes." 20 minutes later, Grace walked out of the electronics store with a digital recorder small enough to hide in her clothing and powerful enough to capture clear audio in a large room. Her hands were shaking as she hailed a taxi back to Montgomery Holdings, but her mind was crystal clear about what she had to do. The lobby of Montgomery Holdings felt different when she returned, charged with anticipation and dread, like the air before a thunderstorm. The PharmaCorp executives were still in the building, probably reviewing final documents and preparing for what they believed would be a routine signing ceremony. Grace wondered if they knew about Clayton's true agenda, or if they were simply opportunistic vultures taking advantage of what appeared to be a distressed asset sale. She took the elevator to the 40th floor, her heart hammering against her ribs as she approached Clayton's office. Through the glass walls, she could see him on the phone, his back turned to the door as he spoke in animated whispers, the predator preparing for his final kill. Grace knocked softly and entered when Clayton gestured her inside. He ended his call quickly and turned to face her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Grace? Back so soon? I hope this means you've made the sensible decision." "I've made a decision," Grace replied, closing the door behind her and activating the recording device in her pocket. "But I'm not sure it's the one you wanted to hear." Clayton's expression sharpened. "Oh? And what decision is that?" Grace took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether justice was served or whether she would become Clayton's next victim. "I'm not taking your money, Clayton, and I'm not running away. Bill deserves to know the truth about what you did to Margaret and about what you're planning to do to him." The mask finally fell away completely. Clayton's face transformed into something cold and reptilian, his civilized veneer evaporating like morning mist. "That's unfortunate," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Because now I'm going to have to kill you the same way I killed my dear sister. Slowly, painfully, and in a way that no one will ever trace back to me." Grace felt ice water flooding her veins, but she forced herself to keep talking, to draw out more incriminating statements. "Why did you do it, Clayton? Why did you murder Margaret?" "Because she forgot where she came from." Clayton's voice turned savage with long-suppressed rage. "We were supposed to take care of each other, supposed to be family forever. But she chose money over blood, chose that self-righteous bastard over her own brother." The confession was everything Detective Chen needed. But Grace realized with growing horror that she might not live long enough to deliver it. Clayton was moving toward his desk drawer, and something in his manner suggested he kept more than office supplies hidden there. Outside, the clock on Clayton's wall read 2:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, Bill Montgomery would walk into the conference room to sign documents that would destroy his life, completely unaware that the woman trying to save him was about to pay the ultimate price for her courage. Grace Walker had come too far to stop now, but she was beginning to understand that some truths could only be revealed through the ultimate sacrifice. Clayton's hand moved toward the desk drawer with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving Grace's face as he savored the moment of her realization. She had walked willingly into his web, and now she would pay the price for her meddling in affairs far beyond her understanding. "You know, Grace, I actually admire your courage," he said, his voice taking on the conversational tone of a man discussing the weather rather than murder. "It takes real spine to walk back in here knowing what I'm capable of. Margaret had that same foolish bravery at the end, still trying to save people even as the poison ate away at her from the inside." Grace forced herself to remain still, knowing that any sudden movement might trigger violence before she could extract more of the confession that Detective Chen needed. The recording device in her pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, a tiny machine capturing evidence that might be her only legacy if she didn't survive the next few minutes. "Tell me about the poison," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "How did you do it? How did you make it look like cancer complications?" Clayton's smile was the expression of a craftsman proud of his work. "Sodium azide, delivered in carefully measured doses through her daily vitamins. Margaret always was health-conscious, took her supplements religiously. It was almost too easy. The symptoms mimicked advanced cancer perfectly, and with her legitimate oncologist managing the primary treatment, no one thought to look for toxins." "But why the elaborate charade? If you wanted her dead, there were easier ways." "Because I didn't want her dead, you stupid girl." Clayton's voice turned sharp with genuine anguish. "I wanted her to come home. I wanted her to remember that blood matters more than money, that family is the only thing that lasts. Every dose I gave her was supposed to be a wake-up call, a reminder that she needed me to take care of her." Grace felt sick as she understood the twisted logic. "You were torturing her to make her dependent on you. I was saving her from a marriage that was killing her slowly." Clayton pulled a small vial from his desk drawer, its contents clear as water, but deadly as snake venom. "Bill Montgomery turned my sister into a corporate wife, all charity galas and board meetings and empty social obligations. She used to paint. Did you know that? Watercolors of the Tennessee mountains we grew up in. But after she married him, she stopped. Said she didn't have time for childish hobbies." The pain in Clayton's voice was real, Grace realized with growing horror. In his damaged mind, he had convinced himself that murder was an act of love, that destroying Margaret's happiness was somehow preserving her soul. She loved him, Clayton. Margaret chose Bill because she loved him. She chose his money! Clayton slammed the vial down on the desk, his composure finally cracking. Just like everyone else in this godforsaken world, she chose security over authenticity, wealth over family. Well, now she's found out what those choices cost. Grace could hear voices in the corridor outside, the PharmaCorp executives moving toward the conference room for the 3 o'clock signing. Time was running out for everyone. And now you're going to destroy Bill the same way you destroyed Margaret. Justice, not destruction. Clayton's voice regained its cold control. Bill Montgomery is going to learn what it feels like to lose everything that matters, just like Margaret did when our parents split us up, just like I did when she chose him over me. The merger isn't about money at all, is it? Grace understood now. You could have embezzled millions over the years without anyone noticing. This is about revenge. This is about balance. Clayton unscrewed the cap of the vial, his movements precise despite his emotional state. Margaret died believing that Bill would always be there to protect her, that his money and power could shield her from the consequences of abandoning her family. Now he gets to die the same way, slowly, betrayed by someone he trusted, realizing too late that all his wealth can't save him from the truth about loyalty. Grace's blood turned to ice as she realized what Clayton intended. You're going to poison him too. Eventually. But first I'm going to watch him lose everything, his company, his reputation, his hope. And then, when he's broken and alone and desperate, I'll offer him the same choice I offered Margaret. Come back to the family, acknowledge that blood is thicker than water, or suffer the consequences. Except Bill isn't your family. Margaret was your sister, but Bill is just an innocent man who loved the wrong woman. Clayton's laugh was the sound of sanity finally snapping. Innocent! Bill Montgomery stole my sister's heart and turned her against her own blood. He's as guilty as she was, and he's going to pay the same price. Through the glass wall of Clayton's office, Grace could see Bill entering the conference room, his face set with the grim determination of a man preparing to sign documents he believed would secure his company's future. He had no idea that he was walking into the final act of a tragedy that had begun 20 years ago with 2 orphaned children who had learned different lessons about love and loyalty. "Last chance, Grace," Clayton said, moving around his desk toward her. "Take the money and disappear, or join Margaret in whatever comes after this life. Those are your only choices." Grace looked at the vial of poison in Clayton's hand, at the madness blazing in his eyes, at the check for $50,000 lying on his desk like a tombstone marker. In the distance, she could hear the murmur of voices from the conference room as the PharmaCorp executives prepared to execute their fraudulent contract. "There's a third choice," she said quietly. "Really? And what's that?" Grace smiled, and for the first time since entering Clayton's office, she felt genuinely calm. The truth. She pulled out her phone and held it up so Clayton could see the screen, a direct line to Detective Sarah Chen, who had been listening to every word of their conversation through the phone's speaker function. The recording device in Grace's pocket had been backup insurance, but the real evidence was being transmitted in real time to the Nashville Metro Police Department. Clayton's face went white as he understood the scope of his miscalculation. "You clever little bitch." "Detective Chen?" Grace spoke directly to the phone. "Did you get enough for a warrant?" Sarah Chen's voice came through the speaker with professional authority. "More than enough. Clayton Reeves, by the power vested in me by the state of Tennessee, you are under arrest for the murder of Margaret Montgomery and the attempted murder of Grace Walker. Officers are on their way up now." Clayton lunged for Grace with the vial of poison, but she was ready for him. Years of caring for her ailing father had taught her how to move quickly in crisis situations, and she sidestepped his attack while grabbing the heavy crystal paperweight from his desk. The paperweight connected with Clayton's temple with a sickening thud, and he collapsed to the floor as the vial shattered against the wall, its deadly contents spreading across the carpet like spilled tears. Grace stood over Clayton's unconscious form, her chest heaving with adrenaline and relief as the sound of police sirens wailed up from the street below. In the conference room, she could see Bill looking around in confusion as the commotion began to penetrate the building's corporate calm. "It's over," Grace whispered to Detective Chen's voice on the phone. "Margaret can finally rest." But even as she spoke the words, Grace knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Clayton was defeated, but Bill still didn't know the truth about his wife's murder or his best friend's betrayal. The merger documents were still unsigned, but the PharmaCorp executives were still in the building, waiting for explanations that would shatter everything Bill thought he knew about his life. The truth had finally emerged from 20 years of shadows, but Grace understood that some revelations were almost as devastating as the lies they replaced. The police sirens had long since faded into the Nashville afternoon when Bill Montgomery finally understood the full scope of the betrayal that had shaped the last 20 years of his life. He sat in his office chair like a man carved from stone, Margaret's journal open on his desk beside the photographs that documented Clayton's systematic theft of both his wife's life and his company's assets. Detective Chen had been thorough in her explanation, walking Bill through each piece of evidence with the methodical precision of someone who understood that truth delivered too quickly could shatter a man's sanity. Grace sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold hours ago, watching his face as he absorbed revelations that rewrote everything he thought he knew about love, friendship, and loss. 20 years, Bill said finally, his voice hollow as winter wind. 20 years I blamed myself for not being there when she needed me. 20 years I carried the guilt of thinking my work was more important than her care. He looked up at Grace with eyes that held a pain deeper than grief. All this time, the man I trusted to protect her was the one killing her. Grace reached across the desk and touched his hand gently. "You couldn't have known, Bill. Clayton was very good at being what people needed him to be. That's how predators survive, by wearing masks that look exactly like the faces we want to see." But the signs were there, weren't they? The way he always pushed me to take longer business trips during her treatment, the way he insisted on managing her medication schedule, the way he... Bill's voice broke as the memories realigned themselves into a pattern of manipulation he had been too trusting to recognize. My God, he was there when she died, holding her hand, telling me how peacefully she went, and all the time he knew he had murdered her. Detective Chen closed her notebook with a soft snap. "Mr. Montgomery, I understand this is overwhelming, but I need you to know that Clayton Reeves is going to face the full weight of justice for what he's done. The evidence Miss Walker gathered, combined with his recorded confession, makes this case ironclad. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison." Bill nodded absently, but Grace could see that the promise of Clayton's punishment brought him no comfort. Justice for the dead was a cold satisfaction when weighed against the weight of revelation and regret. "What about PharmaCorp?" Grace asked. "The merger documents, the shell companies, how deep does the conspiracy go?" "We're investigating their involvement now," Detective Chen replied. "Initial interviews suggest they may have been unwitting participants in Clayton's scheme, believing they were acquiring a legitimately distressed asset. If that proves true, they'll face civil liability, but probably not criminal charges." The conference room across the hall stood empty now, its polished table littered with unsigned contracts and abandoned briefcases. The PharmaCorp executives had fled the building when police arrived, their dreams of easy profit dissolved by the reality of criminal investigation and media scrutiny. "Mr. Montgomery," Detective Chen continued, "I'll need you to come to the station tomorrow for a formal statement. We'll also need access to company financial records going back 5 years to trace the full extent of Clayton's embezzlement." "Of course. Whatever you need." Bill's voice carried the mechanical compliance of someone too emotionally exhausted to process practical details. After Detective Chen left, Grace and Bill sat in silence as Nashville's skyline began to glow with the golden light of late afternoon. The crisis was over, the truth had been revealed, and justice was finally in motion, but the victory felt hollow in the face of such devastating betrayal. "Grace," Bill said finally, "I need you to know something. When I first found you in this office reading those financial reports, when I saw the intelligence in your eyes and heard the pain in your story, I thought maybe God was giving me a second chance at protecting someone who needed protection." He paused, struggling with words that carried more weight than any business contract. "I was wrong. You weren't sent here for me to protect. You were sent here to save me." Grace felt tears she had been holding back for hours finally spill down her cheeks. "I couldn't save my father, Bill. I watched him die slowly while people who claimed to be helping him were really just prolonging his suffering for profit. When I found Margaret's journal, when I realized what Clayton had done to her, I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't let another good person be destroyed by someone they trusted." "You risked everything," Bill said, wonder creeping into his voice. "Your job, your safety, your mother's security. You put it all on the line for a woman you never met and a man you barely knew." "I knew enough." Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I knew you were the kind of man who kept fresh flowers on his desk 3 years after his wife died. I knew you were the kind of boss who remembered the names of cleaning staff and asked about their families. I knew Margaret had chosen well when she married you, and that she deserved to have her murder exposed and punished." Bill stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had been the backdrop for both his greatest happiness and deepest betrayal. "What happens now, Grace? The company will survive. The real assets are still sound, and without Clayton's embezzlement bleeding us dry, we'll actually be stronger than before. But I don't know how to rebuild trust when the person I trusted most was systematically destroying everything I loved." Grace joined him at the window, standing close enough to offer comfort without presuming intimacy. "You start with the truth, Bill. You tell the employees what happened, you implement new oversight procedures, and you remember that most people are good. Clayton was an exception, not the rule." "And personally?" Bill's voice was barely above a whisper. "How do I trust my own judgment again? How do I believe in friendship or partnership or—" He turned to face her, his eyes searching her face as if looking for an answer to questions he couldn't quite articulate. "You start small," Grace said softly. "You trust the people who have proven themselves worthy of trust. You build relationships based on honesty and transparency. You remember that love, real love, doesn't require you to be perfect or invulnerable. It just requires you to be genuine." They stood together in the fading light, two people who had found each other in the midst of tragedy and conspiracy, who had discovered that sometimes the most important connections were forged in the fires of crisis rather than the comfort of easy times. "Grace," Bill said, his voice stronger now, carrying a note of possibility that hadn't been there since Margaret's death. "I know this is too soon, and I know you've been through hell today, but I need to ask you something." Grace felt her heart rate quicken, understanding that they had reached another crossroads, a moment that would determine whether their relationship would remain defined by the crisis that brought them together or evolve into something deeper and more lasting. "What would you like to ask me, Bill?" "Would you consider staying? Not as a cleaning lady, Not as someone I rescued or someone who rescued me, but as my partner in rebuilding this company into something Margaret would have been proud of. Something honest and good and worthy of the sacrifice you made to save it? Grace smiled, feeling hope bloom in her chest for the first time in years. I'd like that very much. 6 months later, spring had returned to Nashville with the gentle persistence of hope after a long winter. Grace Walker, now Grace Montgomery, stood in the sunlit kitchen of the home she shared with Bill, watching her mother Helen arrange wildflowers in a mason jar with the careful attention of someone rediscovering joy in small rituals. The transformation in Helen had been remarkable to witness. With proper medical care, therapy, and most importantly, the security of knowing she was loved and protected, the shadows that had haunted her eyes for years had gradually lifted. She still had difficult days, moments when the trauma of watching her husband suffer would resurface without warning, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. "The daffodils are particularly beautiful this year," Helen observed, her voice carrying the quiet contentment of someone who had learned to appreciate simple pleasures after nearly losing the ability to find any pleasure at all. "Your father always said spring flowers were God's way of reminding us that endings aren't really endings. They're just new beginnings, wearing different clothes." Grace smiled, recognizing the philosophical bent that had emerged in her mother's recovery. Helen had begun writing in a journal, working through her grief and trauma with words instead of bottling them up in silence. The process was painful but healing, and Grace found herself learning from her mother's courage in facing difficult truths. Bill entered the kitchen carrying the morning newspaper, his reading glasses perched on his nose and his silver hair still mussed from sleep. At 49, he carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a man who had survived the worst betrayal imaginable and emerged stronger on the other side. The haunted look that had defined him for 3 years after Margaret's death had been replaced by something Grace could only describe as peaceful determination. "Good morning, ladies," he said, dropping a gentle kiss on Grace's forehead before squeezing Helen's shoulder affectionately. "Sleep well, Helen?" "Like a baby," Helen replied, and Grace marveled at how naturally Bill had integrated her mother into their family dynamic. There had been no awkwardness, no sense that Helen was an intrusion on their newlywed happiness. Bill had simply expanded his definition of family to include the woman who had raised the extraordinary daughter who had saved his life. The newspaper carried a small item on the business page about Clayton Reeves's sentencing hearing scheduled for the following month. The disgraced former CFO had pled guilty to all charges in exchange for a life sentence without parole, sparing everyone the ordeal of a lengthy trial. Grace felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a deep sadness for the waste of a life that could have been lived differently. "Any regrets about not testifying in court?" Bill asked, noticing her expression as she read the article. "No," Grace said firmly. "Clayton confessed everything in that recorded conversation. My testimony wouldn't have added anything except more pain for everyone involved. Some stories are better told once and then allowed to rest." The kitchen filled with the comfortable silence of people who had learned to appreciate each other's presence without the need for constant conversation. Outside the window, Nashville was waking up to another day of possibility, and Grace found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed since that night she had first whispered her warning in Bill's ear. Montgomery Holdings had not only survived Clayton's betrayal, but had thrived under the new leadership structure Bill and Grace had implemented together. As vice president of operations, Grace had brought a combination of financial acumen and genuine care for employees that had transformed the company culture. They had established an ethics oversight committee, implemented transparent financial reporting, and created an employee assistance program that provided support for workers facing personal crises. Most importantly, they had established the Margaret Montgomery Foundation, dedicated to supporting families dealing with medical fraud and domestic violence. The Foundation's work had already helped dozens of families navigate the complex aftermath of betrayal and abuse, providing both practical assistance and emotional support. "I have something for you," Bill said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Grace's breath caught. They had been married for 3 months, but this was clearly not a belated wedding gift. "Bill, what?" "Open it." Inside the box was a delicate gold locket, antique in style but clearly newly made. Grace opened it to find 2 photographs, one of her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful and deeply in love, and another of Margaret, smiling with the radiant joy of someone who had never imagined her life could be touched by such darkness. "I thought it was time," Bill said softly. "Time to honor the people who brought us together, even if they can't be here to see what we've built." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes as she understood the deeper meaning of his gift. For months she had struggled with the feeling that her happiness with Bill somehow dishonored Margaret's memory, that building a new life on the foundation of tragedy was somehow morally complicated. But the locket represented something different, not replacement, but continuity. Not forgetting the past, but allowing it to inform and enrich the future. "Help me put it on?" she asked, and Bill's hands were gentle as he fastened the chain around her neck. Helen watched this exchange with the knowing smile of someone who had learned to recognize love in its various forms. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking about what your father would say if he could see us now. 3 people who have every reason to be bitter and afraid, sitting in this beautiful kitchen, planning a future full of hope." "What do you think he'd say?" Grace asked. "That love is the only thing that makes sense in a world that often doesn't make sense at all. That choosing to trust again after being betrayed is the most courageous thing a person can do, and that sometimes the best families aren't the ones you're born into, but the ones you create through choice and commitment and daily acts of kindness." Bill reached across the table to take both women's hands, creating a circle of connection that felt as strong as any blood bond. "To second chances," he said. "To new beginnings," Grace added. "To the family we choose," Helen concluded. Outside, the Nashville skyline gleamed in the morning sun, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, calling people to worship, to community, to the weekly ritual of gathering together to affirm that hope was stronger than despair, love more powerful than hate, and truth more enduring than lies. Grace thought of Margaret's journal, now safely stored in their home safe alongside other important documents, its pages serving not as evidence of tragedy, but as testimony to the endurance of the human spirit. Margaret had died, trying to protect the man she loved from a predator who wore the face of friendship, and in doing so she had set in motion a chain of events that had ultimately brought justice, healing, and unexpected joy. The truth had indeed set them free, free from deception, free from the burden of undeserved guilt, free to love without reservation or fear. And in a world where trust was often difficult and betrayal sometimes inevitable, they had learned that the greatest courage lay not in avoiding risk, but in remaining open to connection despite the possibility of pain. As Grace fingered the locket around her neck, she whispered a silent promise to the photographs within, to her parents, to Margaret, to all the people who had loved imperfectly but genuinely in a complicated world. She promised to honor their memory by living fully, loving deeply, and never losing faith in the fundamental goodness that existed in most human hearts. Dear friends, Grace and Bill's story reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments lead to our greatest blessings, and that love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. In a world where trust feels risky and betrayal seems commonplace, their journey shows us that choosing to remain open to connection, despite past hurts, is perhaps the bravest thing we can do. For those of us who have lived long enough to experience both heartbreak and healing, we understand that second chances at love and family don't diminish what came before. They honor it by proving that hope is stronger than despair. Have you ever found unexpected love or family in the midst of your most difficult times? What would you tell someone who's afraid to trust again after being deeply hurt? Share your wisdom in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone needs to hear today.